It is now my real pleasure to introduce internationally celebrated author Lee Child, best known for his nail-biting Jack Reacher series. And I think this is his 20th in his Jack Reacher series. So before becoming a true crime fiction powerhouse, this English native attended law school. Although he had no intention of ever practicing law, he had no intentions initially of becoming an author either. But that didn't stop his first novel, Killing Floor, from being dubbed Best First Mystery in award circles. He has since won other top crime and mystery literary honors, including Anthony, Barry, and Nero awards. If we didn't already know he ruled the genre, he is currently the co-president of the International Thriller Writers Professional Organization. So I think you all probably know this. Tom Cruise took on the role of Mr. Child's famous hero in the 2012 movie Jack Reacher. He's waiting for your questions, I know that. He's ready for you. Mr. Child's new book, Make Me, is book 20 in the Reacher series. In it, his resourceful protagonist finds intrigue in the tiny town of Mother's Rest. The Huffington Post calls this a brilliantly crafted mystery and one of Child's best. He will be interviewed tonight by Linda Fairstein, a best-selling novelist in her own right. She served as the chief of the sex crimes unit of the district attorney's office in Manhattan for more than 2 decades before going on to be author of 17 internationally best-selling books featuring, according to O, the Oprah Magazine, a fascinating heroine based on the equally fascinating life of her creator. It should be a fascinating interview. It's wonderful to have them both here with us tonight. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Lee Child and Linda Fairstein to the Free Library.
And I will start by asking you, Lee, what you've been asked so many times before. For many of us, writing fiction is a second career. And some of you come to this knowing everything there is to know about Lee, and I'm hoping some of you have things to learn. But I would love you, Lee, to tell us first what you did before, what brought you to this genre that you do better than anybody in the world, and how you named Jack Reacher.
Well, first of all, let me say thank you, Linda, for doing this. This is, I don't often do this on-stage conversation thing, and it's been a real dream on this tour because they said to me, do you want to do on-stage conversation? And I said, yeah. And they said, who do you want to do it with? And I named all my favorites, and they all said, yeah. So I'm a big fan of Linda's stuff, and really grateful that you're doing this. So yeah, I was basically originally a theater person. I went to, when I was in high school, I had like what we used to call a vacation job. Now you would call it interning, I guess, at various theaters, including Birmingham Rep and the Royal Shakespeare Company in Stratford. And, I go so far back with that my name-dropping line is the first time I ever worked with Laurence Olivier, he was still in his 60s. But there was really, theater was great, but it was, I was a very sort of, it was the early 1970s, and one was very earnest intellectually. And there was this British theater director called Peter Brook, who was incredibly influential. He did a fantastic Midsummer Night's Dream at Stratford that really changed the whole game. And then he published a book called The Empty Space, where he argued that all the theater needs is a script, some actors, and an empty space in which to perform. And me being a backstage person and being sort of serious, I read this book and I thought, yes, he's right. There's no role for me. I don't really have a valid organic role. One was that earnest back then. So I decided I'll go to television where they got to have backstage people because, television happens technologically. So I went to work for a British company called Granada Television, and not specifically because of me, but at that point they then entered this fantastic golden age, especially of drama production. We did Jewel in the Crown, Brideshead Revisited, Prime Suspect, Cracker, just one thing after another, plus a documentary strand that often gets forgotten now that was really, really serious. And I just loved that job. I totally loved it. Until one day, my boss said to me something that made it just impossible for me to continue there. He said, "You're fired." which, I hasten to add, not because of any misdemeanor or felony or anything like that. It was just the 1990s, and they suddenly figured out they could do, they could get a recent graduate to do this for like a tenth of the price. And, by that point, I was 39 years old, very nearly 40, and a veteran. I'd been there 18 years, and I had a pension, I had union benefits, all that kind of stuff. In fact, I was the union shop steward. And before we get to the origin of Reacher's name, that was kind of the origin of, that was my real-life Reacher moment, because we knew this was coming. And I'd been, as a union member, I'd been a deputy shop steward. And the actual shop steward was this old guy who was about to retire. And the management position was, we're going to let this guy retire, but we'll intimidate anybody from replacing him. We're putting about this absolute promise that if anybody stands to be shop steward, they will be fired within a week and never work in the business again. And I remember thinking, that's not right. So I put my name forward. Amazingly, the only candidate. And so I put my name up, and this manager came to see me and said, that's ridiculous. We're going to fire you within a week. You'll never work again. And I said, we'll see about that, asshole. And that week turned into actually, I think, about 115 weeks. It was like 2 years and 3 months or something before they got rid of me. But they did get rid of me in the end. But having won a lot of battles along the way, which was just, it was hilarious. It was, in a way, it really took my mind off the disappointment of being let go from something that I was enjoying doing. It was just a guerrilla warfare thing. It was fabulous. Initially, I tried to I thought we would play it rather honestly, by the rules and so on. But very quickly, there was some dispute where they absolutely just cheated. And I thought, all right, if you want to fight dirty, I'll show you how we fight dirty. And from that point on, it was mayhem for 2 years. They made the fundamental mistake of not understanding that they were 9 to 5, Monday to Friday workers, whereas the rest of us we worked all around the clock 7 days a week. So as soon as they were out of the parking lot on the way home, I had like a SWAT team of cleaners would bring me the content of every trash can. They would search under every photocopier platter to make sure that, because people leave documents there. We steamed open their mail. And there were a lot of engineers in television, obviously, duh. So I had these engineers hacking into the computers, and they figured that out and put keyboard locks on. So then I had the engineers take out the hard drives, take them home, copy them, and bring them back. So I was the best informed shop steward ever, but it still came to a sticky end after that couple of years, and I was out of work. So it was a question of what next? And I thought, I'll write a book. I've read some. How hard can it be?
Been there.
And I played a sort of psychological trick on myself, I think, in as much as I just assumed this would work. Of course it'll work. I write the book, it'll work, definitely. And now I realize that, I was just bolstering myself up, not allowing myself to feel any doubt about it. But of course, my wife was feeling a certain amount of doubt about it, because she was like, so what are you going to do now? And she put on a really brave face about it. But the real tragedy for being out of work is that you are available to do errands at home. That was the worst part of it. And that it sort of enabled two things, actually. Number one thing was that I really knew this was going to work for me, because I remember on a Friday night, she said, we've got to go and do such and such a thing tomorrow. And I remember thinking, damn, I really wanted to write that next scene in exactly the same way that you would feel if somebody interrupted reading. When you're reading a really, really good book and somebody makes you put it down, you have that kind of, you don't want to do it, right? You want to keep on reading. Well, I wanted to keep on writing, so I thought, this could work, actually, from that moment. And then we get to whatever it was we had to do on the Saturday, which was to she wanted me to go to the supermarket with her because I'm available, right? And she's very small. She can't haul all the stuff home, so I go to the supermarket with her. And every single time that I've ever been in a supermarket, which by now must number well into double figures, every time I walk in, there is a little old lady who says to me, "Oh, you're a nice tall gentleman. Would you reach me that box?" So my wife said, if this writing gig doesn't work out, you could be a reacher in a supermarket.
I love that story, so thank you. That's Reacher. Thank you for that. I know you have a great newspaper here in Philly. We think the New York Times is the paper record in New York. Actually, as a prosecutor, it was the New York Post, but the Times is it. And you've been all over the Times lately. You wrote a very long, intense, thought-through cover of the New York Times Sunday Book Review a few weeks ago about another author. You have been reviewed by Janet Maslin, a daily that is about Make Me, one of the things we're here to talk about, which is quite stunning. You had Marilyn Stasio, who writes a crime column every couple of Sundays, another great review in that one. What you probably don't get here, you should go online and see, is a great piece in the Metropolitan section every Sunday called Sunday Routine. And this Sunday featured Lee with his personal Sunday routine, what he likes to do with his Sundays. But the crowning achievement, from my perspective, is that in Sunday's New York Times book review bestseller lists, ebook, hardcover fiction, and hardcover combined, Make Me debuts at number 1 on the New York Times list. Which is quite thrilling. So that's not the first time this happened. I would love to know which book that was the first time. I've never been there, so from my perspective, I would love to know what it feels like at this point. If you talk a little bit about that being here and in England and probably everywhere else in the world.
I mean, yeah, it's, happily it is everywhere in the English-speaking world is number 1 at the moment, probably in some other countries as well, as if they've got the translations ready. But I cannot tell you how it feels, especially from my point of view as an immigrant. And this goes back more than 50 years, actually, this feeling, because as a kid, I loved the Beatles, like we all did. And I bought very quickly, there was a very early biography of the Beatles by Hunter Davis, I think it was, in which he related an episode, January of 1964. The Beatles were playing a week in Paris at the Olympia, staying in the Georges V Hotel. And this was the month before the Ed Sullivan appearance, but I Want to Hold Your Hand was released in the US that month. So they come off stage, they played at the Olympia, they go back to the hotel, they're all up there in the room. This is all according to Hunter Davis's book. They're in somebody's room and the phone rings and it's a transatlantic phone call, which was a big deal in 1964. It wasn't like it is now. I mean, it's unbelievable now. I was in the car the other day doing an interview with a newspaper in the west of Australia, on my cell phone. It's unbelievable. Think back 50 years to when a transatlantic phone call was a big, big deal. So Brian Epstein takes the call and he listens and he puts the phone down. He says, "Boys, you're number 1 in America." And I read that sentence and it just assumed this massive thing in my life. The idea that from the outside you could penetrate this enormous, glamorous market and possibly be number 1. So in a completely shameless and meretricious way, that was always my ambition, Unfortunately, I could not be in the Beatles for a number of practical reasons, but this is the next best thing, and to be number 1 in America is just beyond, it's just the greatest possible thing for me. It really is.
But how many times now?
Well, it's actually 11 books out of 20 now, although 2 of them are kind of. Well, the first ever number 1 I had was only a paperback number 1, of book number 11. And then hardcover number 12 was number 1, and they all have been since then. And then, of course, When the movie came out, the tie-in edition went to #1 in paperback. So it's 11 titles out of 20, I think, have been #1. But it took a long time to get there, and that's something that I'm sure you get as well, that, you've done 17 books, you're an established name, and people imagine that it happens overnight. But it really doesn't, does it?
No, it doesn't. But 4, I've only gotten to 4, Lee. I want to
Well,
get to
4
1.
is pretty damn good,
And we were talking on the way down, not about that question, but about, I think from a writer's perspective, these are all book buyers. Explain what it's like as we're waiting for the results of the first week's sales. How hard it is in this day and age, and what, you're writing Harper Lee, who, love her, but she may not even know this book has been published. She's been #1 since she was published in July, and maybe once knocked off the spot. So there are so many books coming out. Talk about that for a bit.
Yeah, there are, and it's, this is, obviously it's a joy, and it's an art, and it's creativity, and it's all of those good things, but it's also a business. Business for us at our level, but much more of a business for the publisher at their level. So these things are planned, they're planned well in advance. Literally, and this is how you tell you're making progress. In the old days, they would plan, well, we can't put him here because there's this guy, we can't put him in that week because there's that guy. They find you a week where you might stand a chance. And now, happily, it's the other guys dodging me. So they pick a week, but even so, they put a lot of thought into it. And actually, they change it all the time. My book came out September 8th, and that was actually its original pub date, but they changed it 3 or 4 times until settling back on September the 8th. And then that was done a long time ago. And we heard that there was going to be the Lagerkrantz girl in the spider's web probably the week before, but we had no idea at all about the Harper Lee. That was a surprise. And so, yeah, you do worry about it. You think, because that's the other thing. Graham Greene said, success for a writer is merely failure delayed. And so you're just always waiting for it to not to be #1. Is this the year when it's not? And happily, this is not the year, but next year probably will be. Yeah.
Well, I don't think so. But one of the things that you said in the Sunday Routine piece this weekend was what a disadvantage it is for a writer to write, in that it takes you away from reading so many other good books. 2 questions you don't have to ask Lee or me when the Q&A starts. Is he as nice as he seems to be? He is nicer than he seems to be. And 2, is he smart? He's so smart. He knows books, he knows music, he knows life, he knows so many things. So I would love you to talk about reading and books and what they are to you.
I mean, they're everything to me, but that's true of all writers. That is the only preparation you can do to be a writer, is to have been a reader. And if you suddenly decide you want to be a writer, you've got to look back and say, have I read thousands or tens of thousands of books in my life? And if you haven't, it's too late. I'm sorry. If you have, then you stand a chance of being a writer. And I've always... because when I'm very old and I come from a place very far away, and when I grew up in England, it was my earliest memories, I guess, are about, well, in fact, I know my earliest memory, actually. It was October of 1957. I remember it because we flew to Ireland to visit my grandparents on an old war surplus Douglas Dakota that had been pressed into duty as an airline plane. And I remember that I was just about to turn 3. And I remember it specifically it was not a pressurized plane, and so as it was coming into land, the steward came around with a silver platter with hard candy on it. And I remember thinking, wow, all this and free candy too? So that's my earliest memory. But in 1957, Britain was, dour, depressed, grey, not terrible economically, but very narrowly pinched. Nobody was terribly poor because of the welfare state, but certainly nobody was very rich either. We were just all sort of bumping along the bottom, more or less. And it was boring, just a boring, pinched kind of environment where you felt that, you just felt a bit, as a kid, you felt a bit hopeless, partly because of the war legends that were our daily consumption, and if you remember, Winston Churchill said that that 1940 should be Britain's finest hour. And there's no question that it was. That was a magnificent achievement to have participated and eventually won World War II. But the problem was that gave a kid the sensation that everything was in the past. There was nothing ahead. It was all in the past. All the good stuff was gone. So we were all kind of rootless, a bit aimless and a bit depressed. And I turned to reading. That was the only thing that would cheer me up. And we had a local library, which was, my parents were absolutely prepared to buy books, but they just couldn't afford it. Books were not in any way forbidden, but they just couldn't afford it, so we had to go to the library. And my local library was what you guys would call a Quonset hut, what we called a Nissan hut, on a bombed-out patch of ground where a building had been destroyed and not yet rebuilt. And it had, it seemed to me as a 4-year-old, a cornucopia of books, but looking back, it was probably about 400 books. And so I would just read them obsessively, and then as soon as I'd read that entire library, my mother with this, to her, no doubt, it was just a routine thing, but it was great for me. She signed us up for a library across the canal in another township that was much bigger. So again, we would read. And we also operated this Chicago-style thing that if any visitor ever came to the house, we would sign them up for a library card. I think our dog even had a library card. So you were entitled to 4 books at a time, and so because of all these subterfuges, we would take home about 24. But yeah, books were everything. Reading was everything. And, it sounds like I'm just saying it because we're here in a library, but absolutely, libraries saved my life completely. Created my life more than saved it.
Fabulous. You are well known among our friends in common for being so generous about reading other authors in this genre. Stephen King did your interview in Massachusetts the week the book came out, and Laura Lippman in Washington. And I know you read widely in this genre. Tell me some of the other things you like to read.
Oh, I read. I very rarely read science fiction, to be honest, but I just read The Martian. Has anybody read that? Yeah, that is so good. That is so, and also sort of worth figuring out why it's so good. It's good because of the voice. That guy, it just has a great voice. You're just charmed by the guy, and you want to read more. And then I will read. Right now, I'm reading a sort of anthropology book called The Upright. Is it The Upright Thinker or something like that? It's about our journey through evolution. I just read a book about air conditioning called Cool: The History of Air Conditioning in America. I read a book about rust.
I read that one.
I'm going to read next up is the Jay Winnick book, 1944.
Yes.
FDR's big year. I just literally I'll read absolutely anything. So obviously all my peers and friends, partly because I learned a long time ago that, from doing it myself and then observing other people doing it, you put a lot of yourself into the book, or a lot of your current mood or concerns into a book. And so I love to read my friends' books like yours. I'll read your book, and obviously I'm enjoying the story that is presented to me, but also between the lines, I'm thinking, it's like a letter, or it's like an email from you. This is how I was feeling that year. And I find that absolutely fascinating. That started when, years and years ago, I had lunch with Dennis Lehane, and he was very quiet and secretive. He would not talk about what he was doing. And then, like a year later, Mystic River came out, which is a great book. And I read it, and I thought, you bastard, so that's what you were doing. That's what you wouldn't talk to me about.
That's great. I got two other things out of this Sunday routine. It's a small article, but it's got photographs in it. So you learn that Lee goes to museums on Sunday and where he likes to eat and these other things. The two other things I got out of it, this is not a sexist remark, but that picture of you on the couch, that horizontal picture, I know you have long legs, but those are the longest legs I have ever seen in my life. Behind the couch and the legs, there are bookshelves. And I know you've moved recently, and I'm moving recently. Do you collect books as well? Do you have
I can't, not really. I'm not like a book collector that goes out and buys, expensive collector-type books, but I end up with a few of them. I've got, normally I just buy books that I want to read. And, that apartment, I bought that apartment simply because it had some walls where I could put the bookshelves. A lot of apartments now, especially the modern ones, have these glass walls that are all window. And where are you going to put your books? That's no good. So I got this old-fashioned apartment with plenty of linear, and it's tall as well. So I think we've got room for, I think, between 4,000 and 5,000 books, and we're already running out of space. But I do have one or two first editions. Like, if I see something that is cool, or especially my favorite, like Sophie's Choice by William Styron, I think is just one of my favorite books of all time, and so I have a signed first of that. I have Silence of the Lambs signed by Thomas Harris. A small collection, but I'm not an obsessive collector.
Well, I'd love the name of whoever organized your shelves as I'm about to move. That would be really helpful. I'd love you to talk about Jack Reacher. Some of us know where he came, not just the name, but the idea for the character who we all come back to see in every book. So would you tell us something about Jack Reacher?
Well, I think when you say, we all come back to see him in every book, because we want to. We've come to see him in every generation, really. That he is really, I think, a version of, a very ancient and long-running character that you can trace back really for, beyond 2,000 or 3,000 years. If you look at the literature of Europe. Well, first of all, people think that Reacher is essentially an American type of thing, like he's from the Westerns, which, absolutely, Reacher could show up in the Westerns, and characters very like him always have. Zane Grey anybody read Zane Grey? Terrific Western writer who, there's a little homestead, isolated, and for some reason all the men are absent on a cattle drive. It's women and children in desperate trouble. Something terrible is going to happen. And a mysterious rider comes in off the range, and in exchange for a woman-cooked meal, he unsheaths his rifle, he takes care of the problem, and he rides off into the sunset. So, people say, you're just copying the Westerns. And I say, well, not really, because the Westerns copied medieval Europe. That was absolutely a medieval Europe figure, the knight-errant, who, in those stories from the Middle Ages in Europe, it was not a homestead, it was usually a mobile traveling band of pilgrims. And they'd be in the Black Forest, which back then was this immense uncharted waste, very dangerous. And they were in desperate peril, and it was all about to go terrible. And a mysterious knight rides out of the trees, takes care of the problem, and rides on. We've always had that character. That character, Robin Hood, even earlier than that, Scandinavian legends, Anglo-Saxon battle poems, Sir Gawain. You could even argue it goes all religious savior myths of the same character. So we've always liked that character, and Reacher is, I think, just a modern iteration of something that has been around forever. I think humans feel two things simultaneously. One is when everything is going really bad, they would like this guy to show up and fix it for them. And simultaneously, they would like to be that guy. They would like to fix it for other people. Because I think personally that is the appeal of, that ultimately is Reacher's appeal, that I think people are generally speaking, although, your experience professionally at the margins And what we all know, not everybody, but I'm talking about, the vast majority of normal people are thoroughly decent, thoroughly kind, full of goodwill, and would like to do the right thing. But of course, normally we can't do the right thing for a whole bunch of reasons. We're not physically capable, we're inhibited in some way. Maybe it's a work situation where there's not much you can do about it. So generally, real life leaves everybody very frustrated. So they love to turn to a fictional situation where you bet the guy's going to do the right thing, come what may. He's not inhibited by anything. He's going to do the right thing. And I think we take a lot of satisfaction from that.
Thank you. I'd love you to talk a little bit about Make Me. I know I see some of you came in with it. Some of you, I'm sure, have read it. I got an early read by virtue of doing this. It's stunning, and it's what is Mother's Rest. Would you talk a little bit about this book? And
yeah, I mean, it was. I love the sitting down to start part. People ask me which is my favorite book, and I always say the next one, because no book is ever quite as good as you hope it will be, and so you look at the next one and you think, well, I haven't screwed that up yet. But I remember.
I'm going to interrupt you just to say, for me, the sitting down to start is like saying I have root canal at the dentist tomorrow. It is just the worst point in time for me.
I'm the exact opposite. I love that blank screen. You can start anywhere, do anything. I just love that. And I remember starting it out, and I never make a plan. I never have an outline. I never have the slightest idea what the book is going to be about. I just I go through this thing. I always start on the 1st of September, which is a sentimental anniversary of when I started my very first book. So I always start 1st of September. Early part of August, I'm always depressed because I've got no ideas. My career is over. The gas tank is empty. Yeah, right. And then towards the end of August, I think, well, maybe I could do this for the opening scene. And some kind of opening scene pops into my head. And 1st of September, I sit down and I write that opening scene. And it is what it is in the book, that opening sequence. And then I think, all right, what's that about? Who was that guy? Who's killing him and why and what's going on? And I have no idea. So it's just a question of figure it out. Go through the book and figure it out. Why was this happening? Why is it important? What are we going to do about it? So it's step by step. And I love the process. I love the journey, and I love figuring it out. It's a very inefficient way to write, because typically I'll write 2 or 3 sentences and then I have to sit back and scratch my head and think, well, what now? But I keep going until it's finished, and then wherever it ends up, it ends up. And I love it when people say to me, I had it all figured out by page 50. I'm like, really? Because I didn't. And yeah, so it just, I had no idea it would end up where it did, but that's just what happened, sort of organically. And to me, it's a very odd thing. I mean, Linda will testify, I'm a completely normal, rational person, but when I'm doing it, it's real to me. This is what is happening. And therefore, I don't quite get some review comments or editorial comments. People will say, oh, this is implausible, it couldn't have happened. And I say, what do you mean it couldn't have happened? It did happen.
My editor said to me, well, why don't you do this? Why doesn't he do this? Instead, I said, well, in your book, he can do that. But
yeah.
This is my book.
Well, the editor says, wouldn't it be better if this happened after that? And I'll say, yeah, probably, but it didn't. This is the version, and it feels very, literally, it feels dishonest to me to go back and alter something because that was what happened. Even though I know that it really didn't happen, I feel like it did.
I have time for one more question before we open it up. I'm not going to do the movie question. Somebody undoubtedly will. And I am very much looking forward to movie number 2, which begins shooting next week and will open actually next October. So I'm thrilled about that. I can't drop Laurence Olivier's name, so I'll try and go in another direction. In a conversation I had a year ago with William Jefferson Clinton, he said to me, and he's by far the best reader alive that I know. This man loves books and reads voraciously everything, every kind of fiction, nonfiction. He said to me, so what are the chances of ever getting Jack Reacher together with my character's name is Alex Cooper. He said, what do you think the chances are of ever getting it? So here's my first chance to ask you. I've got witnesses. I know we're never going to write a book together. You don't do that. I don't do that. But you do write some short stories for international thriller writers. So a book or two down the road, would you just promise me that you would think about maybe Alex Cooper? Not hooked up. I didn't say that. I just mean get them together in a story. Would you give that some thought?
I would totally would. I absolutely would, because I love stuff like that where, I mean, maybe it's not obvious except to fans of both series, but I did that in at least one other book, I think. My friend Alexandra Brook at that time had a character called Samantha, who was a prosecutor, I think, in Portland, Oregon.
Yes, exactly.
So I had Reacher pass through Portland, Oregon, and just a brief mention, he picked up this DA called Samantha in a cop bar, and then Alexandra was very pleased because I said he spent 2 nights, not just one.
I'm not asking for that, but just a little cameo in the book would be great.
But yeah, Bill Clinton is, I mean, he is just, whatever else Bill Clinton has been as a politician, he is a reader par excellence and just a helpless fan. He sends me a handwritten note after every book telling me what he thinks of it. And we've met a couple of times and had a really good time. And my daughter met him, actually. Years ago, when she was in college, she did a semester overseas in Britain. And Clinton appeared at the Hay Festival. And my agent took my daughter to that event, and it was a very serious foreign policy forum, really. But they suffered through it, and then at the end, my daughter's very shy, really, but she loves kind of celebrity. So she elbowed her way to the front and said, hello, Mr. President. And he was polite, but sort of moved on. And then she said, my dad writes the Jack Reacher books. And he turned back and regaling all these dignitaries from around the world, these foreign ministers from all these countries. This girl's father writes the best character, and all this sort of stuff for like 10 minutes. He is... If everybody read like he reads, that would be fantastic. On the other hand, I've also met President Obama, who we've met at various events, and he does not read my books, but
nor mine.
But also, like very few politicians would, he admits it. He said, "I've never read your books," which is a rare thing.
It is a rare thing, and honesty is good. Well, we're going to let you carry on the conversation.
Hi, thank you. In this book, Jack Reacher seemed a little old. He actually got hurt. Is he getting old? And, thoughts?
Well, I initially intended to be, very honest and straightforward about aging the character, because I thought, why not? You have certain characters who, chronologically must be about 108 years old by now, and you got to be a little realistic about it. Plus, you've got to start them somewhere. You can't have book one as Jack Reacher, boy detective, age 12. So I started him at age 36, really as a homage to Dick Francis. Anybody read Dick Francis? I love Dick Francis, and he is, doesn't really write a series as such, except it really is a series, because the hero is always the same guy, really, just with a different name, and he's always 36 years old. So as a homage to Dick Francis, I made Reacher 36 years old, and in the next book he was 37, and so on. Because at the beginning, of course, you can't predict how long it will carry on. And if you were to say, well, I better take care because 20 years from now, I'm giving myself a problem, you're delusional. The chances of making it for 20 years are very small. So you don't care about that at the beginning. So as it did continue, then I thought, oh God, yeah, the guy's getting pretty old. So I did a couple of prequels, which means that he doesn't age in real time, because those are previous. And then I did a sequence of 4 books that were kind of basically back to back within days of each other. So I figure he is, late 40s maybe by now, sort of theoretically. So, and I felt fine myself. I felt fine until I was maybe about 55. Since then, I feel like a train wreck. But, so he's got a little while to go. But is he getting old? In this book, it was just, I don't want to write the same book every year, so I try and mix things up, and he takes a lot of punishment in every book. And, one of his lines is, why would I have to worry about you? Why would I? It's very unlikely that I'm going to meet somebody I need to worry about. But after 20 books, finally he does meet a guy who's better than average in combat, and he does get hurt, because I think it's reasonable. He's going to. A few books ago, he had his nose broken. Now he has a headache. That's not bad for 20 years of cage fighting.
A little bit more about your writing. Do you write in the daytime, nighttime, and your diet and exercise? Does it affect how you're writing, how quickly you write, or sluggish?
Well,
and also, are you an Aston Villa fan, really?
Yeah, I am an Aston Villa fan, yeah, which is a very character-building thing. I believe I have numerous mottos about writing. One is do it once and do it right. And then somewhat contradictorily, don't get it right, get it written. But the most important motto I've got is nothing of value is ever achieved in the morning. So I don't start until, I usually start, earliest I will ever start is about 12:30, 1 o'clock. And then I just work through sometimes till, as I'm building up momentum, maybe I'll work till 8 o'clock. Towards the end of a book, I'll maybe go back to it at midnight or something like that. In terms of exercise, none whatsoever. The last, running for me is strictly for emergencies. It must be 45 years since I ran anywhere. And diet-wise, I was very, very into, before most people had heard of it, I was into this food group combining thing where you have to limit your food groups and only select from, I choose to select from 2 food groups, caffeine and nicotine. So those are my diet tips. Feel free to follow them.
Random question. With you not reoccurring characters a lot, do you think we'll ever see Susan and Reacher cross paths again?
Well, not repeating the characters is, the way I look at it, being an ex-TV person, is I'm passing up the soap opera thing, and I do not say that in any way disparagingly, because, for nearly 20 years, soap operas put bread on my table, and there is no more powerful narrative engine than a soap opera. And to be honest, no more sophisticated audience than a soap opera audience. These days, a television soap opera is probably running 5 or 6 separate storylines, some of which don't recur for 3 or 4 weeks, and yet the audience is following them all perfectly. So I'm not saying anything bad about soap operas. They've got a lot of strengths, but everybody else was doing it. Every other single series at the time I started was fundamentally a soap opera with a repertory cast of characters and a location and neighbors and jobs and all this kind of thing. So I thought I'll do it differently. This is not a soap opera. This is just one character and nobody else will ever recur. And I knew I was giving up some strengths, but I was also getting some strengths from giving them up. Mainly the freedom. If Reacher was employed in a location, if he was a private eye in Philadelphia, then 20 books would have been fundamentally Philadelphia private eye stories, which would have been, I think, hard work for me. Each book now can be completely radically different from the previous book, which gives me a lot of freedom and a lot of energy. And in terms of recurring characters, I had kind of decided that no character would ever recur. But there have been a number along the way that I've kind of quite liked. So I have brought them back in little roles here or there. So whether Susan will ever come back, like I say, I don't make a plan. I will not know until she shows up. But I would not necessarily rule it out.
My question is about Reacher's signature headbutt. Where did that idea come from? And doesn't it give him concussions and eventually will lead to brain damage?
Well, as far as the concussion goes, the forehead is a very strong structure. Architecturally, an arch is always the strongest, and men at least have this extra ridge of bone there, and he's not doing it more than, possibly half a dozen times a year. He's not like a soccer player who is constantly heading the ball, or not like a football player with helmet-to-helmet collisions. So I think in the real world, you don't have to worry about headbutts giving you concussion. Where they came from was, I just learned it as a kid. It was, I grew up in this industrial city where, and I'm not claiming any kind of, I was no different to anybody else. My situation was absolutely normal and typical. But it was very much a brutal society. There was no recourse to anything other than violence. If you had an issue, it was settled violently on the street. And the headbutt thing, my elder brother, I have a brother 3 years older than me, who is a real geek. Even back then he was like this total nerd, and he had big ears that stick out. And so he was getting mercilessly teased and tormented by the neighborhood kids, and then when he went to school. And I was the opposite. I was gigantic as a kid. And so I was detailed by my parents, and it cost them a lot, really, because they were very respectable people, really. But they had to say to their hooligan second son, your job is to look after your brother. And so, when I started at elementary school at recess, my first duty was to go and find out who was pulling Richard's ears and deal with them. And I learned it then, because it is it's very efficient. There's really, it wastes no time, is the main thing. Because if you're walking up to a person, then it's part of a contiguous motion. You just walk up and do it without even breaking stride. And I got really, really good at it. And I haven't done it actually I guess the last person I headbutted must be, I was a student, I remember, and I had been to, I was a student in England, and you know what fish and chips is? It's like the standard cheap meal, and they serve it wrapped up in newspaper. And I'd gone into the shop and bought some fish and chips. I came out, I had my fish and chips in one hand and my change in the other hand, and this guy was going to mug me. So I didn't want to drop my fish and chips, I didn't want to drop my change, so I just laid him out.
Thank you. Sort of feeding off of your last comment, your last conversation, one of the other questions regarding crossover and repeating characters. I was reading a book by a gentleman named Ian Rankin, and suddenly I stumbled across the name Francis Negley. Any history behind that? Any story behind that?
Yeah, I mean, that is actually, Frances Negley is a real person. She was a nurse in San Francisco. I believe now she's retired, but a really, really nice woman and a very charitable woman. And the reason why her name appears in practically every crime writer's book is that we started a convention, I guess, 10 or 15 years ago, whereby at our reader-writer conferences, wherever we are, there is always a charity auction for the local literacy project. And because writers love literacy projects, because we figure if you teach people to read, then next year they'll be buying our books. So we support them in any way we can, and it used to be the habit would, you give them a signed first edition or a signed poster or whatever it was, and they would auction that off. But then somebody had the idea of auctioning off character names. In other words, saying that the high bidder couldn't get their name in my book or anybody's book who's participating. And it was very quickly discovered that brought in a lot more money than just some signed book, because you can get your book signed for free. You don't have to buy it. So this character name thing started bringing in big bucks for these literacy charities. So they really became very popular. And Frances Negley, who is a real person, she bids on everybody's, and she's in everybody's book.
So geography plays such a strong character in your many books, and I was wondering if these were based on places you've been or how you imagine and conduct your research to have such a strong role.
Actually, that's a smart question because it's a combination of all of those things. Partly it is imagining. Partly it's that I've been there never for the purposes of researching the book. Because, like I said, I don't know where the book is going to take place. So I can't go beforehand to check it out because I don't know yet where it's going to be. But it'll be somewhere I've been before for some other reason. Maybe work, maybe fun, vacation, just traveling, whatever. I'll have been there and I'll have formed first impressions, and then maybe years later I'll use that location for the book. But part of it is imagining because there is this really interesting thing about writing where, in a lot of ways, plausibility is more important than accuracy. And you can be accurate about a place, and somehow doesn't seem plausible. Sometimes you've got to deliberately get things wrong in order for them to seem right. So I'm always prepared to mash up different places, or I'm prepared to skate over the reality in order to make it seem like more plausible. You know, for instance, a very trivial example would be, I wrote a book set in the west of Texas, and I wanted it to have a very, very isolated feel, but I needed there to be some state police involvement. And in the whole world, everybody knows what the state police are, really, or highway patrol. Everybody gets that concept. So I called it the state police, which is not accurate for Texas. In Texas, they're called the Department of Public Safety. But if I had made that accurate, I put in the Department of Public Safety, then fine, people in Texas are going to be happy. But people everywhere else in the world are going to be saying, what's that? Restaurant inspectors? You know, so sometimes you've got to fudge it on behalf of the people that don't know exactly. Same thing, you know, as you know, I come from England. I could write a book about London that would be completely accurate. But I suspect that if I made it completely accurate, you would find it utterly implausible. You would say, this guy's never been to London. Because it doesn't matter what London is really like. It matters what do we collectively think it's like. And those two things are often very different.
You were saying that every September you start a new book. How long does it take you to write a book? On average, months? How long does it take you?
Well, it takes, in the days of working, if I count it up in working days, it takes between 80 and 90 working days to complete the book. But of course, not every day is a working day, so it tends to those spread out. That's about 3 months' work, but it spreads out over about 6 or 7 months.
Number one, welcome back to Philadelphia.
Thank you.
I saw you the last time you were here. And this is not my question, but I haven't heard it from the crowd, so I'm going to be the one that does it. Once you take the book and give it over to the movie people, it's all up to them, and you have to be happy with the check they've given you. But Reacher is 6'5", 250, and the actor that they gave it to was about 5'5", 150. How did you reconcile yourself with what they've done to your bread and butter?
Well, you know, this is, believe it or not, I've had this question before. And, in fact, I think last time I was here we were talking about this, right? I think that it is such a complicated subject where the reader and the writer are going to have various reactions to it, and it seems to me, as a reader, you know, I'm fundamentally a reader, as we said before. You know, we're all readers 100 times more than we're writers, and I read. I have my favorite books and my favorite series, and when I think about my relationship to those favorite books and series, it's a very personal relationship. And the thing about reading is that you have, even though the same book may be read by millions of other people, when you're reading it, you're the only one reading it. It's an intensely personal secret to you. This is your thing. This is your secret. This is your enthusiasm. And over the years, you get to really love it, and you depend on it, and you look forward to it, and it's just wonderful. And I think under those conditions, readers get intensely defensive and intensely upset when their secret is exposed to the world. It's a bit like back in the 60s, if you were the fan of some obscure band, you know, some underground rock band, and then it became popular. You know, somehow that ruined it for you. And I think it's very much the same for reading, in as much as you love this book and you don't want to see it messed around with by other people. In a strange way, you don't even want other people to share it or know about it. It's yours. And so inevitably, when a book moves to the movies, whoever, this is my opinion at this point, whoever the actor had been, whoever it had been, everybody would have been upset because it would not match their mental picture of Reacher. And it really would not match their mental picture of Reacher, because the thing about Cruise is that, believe me, we did not fight our way through massed ranks of 6'5", 250-pound actors in order to find Cruise. There are no 6'5" actors. There are none whatsoever. Like I said, again, to name drop, I worked with Laurence Olivier when he was still in his 60s. I know actors. I've been around actors my entire life. You know, I do. And all actors are small. That is a universal truth. All actors are small. And you've got to ask yourself, why is that? The cinema is 100 years old or more, and there must be some weird optical, physical reason. I mean, think about it the other way around. Suppose somehow the camera and the medium suited very large people. By a natural process of evolution by now, all actors would be huge. But they're not, they're small. Television actors are actually smaller still with large heads. Movie actors tend to have normal-sized heads, but are still very compact people. And, you know, they say to you, they put out PR releases and there's Wikipedia and all that. Don't believe a word of it. The only people that know for sure what size an actor is the wardrobe mistress, because they have got to make the clothes fit. And if you talk to a wardrobe mistress, and, you know, I've known lots, and I was actually talking to one at Warner Brothers not long ago about this exact issue. The people that you think are big are not big. They're really not. I mean, somebody said to me, we should have Daniel Craig play James Bond. Daniel Craig is smaller than Tom Cruise. I was on a plane with him one time, and I was going to the bathroom. I tripped over him. There is... People say Clint Eastwood in his prime would have made a good Reacher. Clint Eastwood is not a big man. If I stood next to Clint Eastwood, I would be 5 inches taller than Clint Eastwood, minimum. Nobody is big in Hollywood. Now, I agree you can make people look big, but that was a decision that we took. You know, for years we'd been batting this thing around, because that movie deal is now 10 years old this year. And so we've been talking about it for a long time and driving ourselves nuts about this argument. You know, here's a guy who is only 8 inches shorter than Reacher, clearly better than this other guy who's 8 1/4 inches shorter than Reacher. And ultimately we just thought, this is ridiculous. Let's just get a guy who can play the feel, the vibe, the internal part of Reacher. And I thought Cruise did that really, really well. And the other part of it, from a writer's point of view, is I don't care. You know, the book is my thing. As far as I'm concerned, the book is the definitive version, and it always will be the definitive version. And I checked when the Jack Reacher movie came out. I pulled down my copy of One Shot from the shelf, opened it up, and all the words were still there. You know, it's exactly the same book. He's the same guy. The movie, I love the people. I would defend Cruise. He was a really, really, really nice guy. It was a pleasure to be around. He was a pleasure to work with. I thought the whole thing was terrific. But having said that, I don't care. You know, the book is the thing. We had a situation like years and years ago where a thrash metal band from Poland emailed us and said they wanted to make a thrash metal album where each track was one of the Reacher books as a 5-minute thrash metal song. Would we mind? And I was like, knock yourself out, whatever. And they even sent us the lyrics for approval, which I couldn't read because they were in Polish. So somewhere out there is a 12-track Polish thrash metal album about the Reacher character. Now, nobody says to me, but that's wrong. Reacher's not Polish. Reacher can't sing. Nobody says that. That is just somebody's parallel version, and the movie is somebody's parallel version. I happen to think it was fine, and I'm looking forward to the next one. But it really doesn't upset me because the book is the thing. And actually, writers get, it's a little, it's tough for writers when people imagine that the book is a kind of a stepping stone, and then they'll judge the eventual project on how the movie looks. From a writer's point of view, the book is the project, and the movie is somebody else's opinion. It's just that simple. And so again, I thought the movie was great. I'm really looking forward to the next one, but I don't care.
Please join me in thanking Lee Child and Linda Fairstein.